Sometimes leadership isn't lost in a scandal or an election defeat. Sometimes it dies right before our eyes, in a public room, under harsh fluorescent lights, when the very people who promised to serve forget what they stood for. What happened? In Dolton, Illinois, wasn't just another messy town meeting. It was a brutal, unforgettable reminder of how power, once earned, can rot from the inside out. And when leaders fall, they don't just drag themselves into the mud. They drag an entire community with them, breaking the fragile trust that holds towns like Dolton together. Dolton isn't a nameless city lost on the map. It's a place where generations of hardworking families have built their lives, where neighbors know each other's names, and where dreams, though often battered by hardship, stubbornly persist. But it's also a township battered by years of economic struggle, political scandal, and growing disillusionment. Many residents have watched their streets crumble, their schools weaken, and their faith in leadership evaporate. They come to board meetings not just out of civic duty, but out of desperate hope. Hope that someone, anyone, will finally listen. The board meeting that fateful Tuesday night was supposed to be one of those ordinary moments of governance. Some new appointments, some budget discussions, maybe a few minor disagreements, the kind of dry but essential work that keeps small towns moving forward. Yet underneath the surface, a storm had been brewing for months, fueled by rumors of corruption, allegations of misuse of power, and a widening gap between the people and those elected to serve them. At the center of this growing storm stood Mayor Tiffany Henyard, once a symbol of change, now increasingly viewed as a dictator clinging to power. Her image had been battered by accusations of arrogance, favoritism, and self-serving leadership. And that night, all the tension came to a boiling point. When activist Jedediah Brown rose to speak during the public comment portion, the room seemed to collectively hold its breath. Brown wasn't just another citizen airing a minor complaint. He carried the anger, betrayal, and crushed hopes of hundreds. His voice didn't quiver. It cut, sharp, deliberate, unapologetic. He accused Henyard of climbing the political ladder, not through merit or hard work, but through manipulation and self-interest. He condemned her leadership as hollow and corrupt, a betrayal to those who once believed in her promises of change. Every word Brown spoke seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, crashing heavily onto the already fragile atmosphere. The tension thickened, the room grew hotter, and the faces around the room grew tighter with every accusation he hurled. And then, with a final devastating blow, he let loose words that would ignite an uncontrollable fire. "You gone, bitch!" The insult didn't just land, it exploded, ripping through the room like a shockwave. Some gasped audibly, others instinctively recoiled in their seats. Phones came up, capturing the moment that would soon rocket across social media. In that instant, it was no longer just about words. It was about pride, ego, and a dangerous loss of control. The room was a ticking time bomb, and Brown's words had lit the fuse, but what followed was even more shocking. Not just anger, but physical confrontation, and from the very people entrusted with leadership. What should have been a night of civic discourse spiraled into a night of violence, forever staining Dolton's already wounded heart. The room gasped. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances as if hoping someone would intervene before things spiraled further. Some attendees, almost instinctively, dropped their eyes to their phones, pretending to be invisible, while others sat frozen, wide-eyed, heartbeats hammering in their ears, as the scene unfolded before them like a slow-motion car crash. No one could stop, but there was one man who didn't stay seated. From the back of the room, Kamal Woods, Henyard's boyfriend and co-leader of the township's at-risk youth program, rose like a storm gathering speed. His face was a mask of barely contained rage. He didn't just walk toward Jedediah Brown. He charged, like a man whose pride had been wounded beyond repair. His fists were clenched, his posture was aggressive, and in that instant, the last fragile thread holding the meeting together snapped. The first shout pierced the heavy air. A chair scraped harshly against the tile floor, toppling as someone jumped out of the way. The next moment was a blur. Fists flying, bodies colliding with brutal force. Kamal and Brown were locked in a violent dance, exchanging heavy punches as shocked gasps turned into screams. The clash wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a furious outpouring of months of buried anger, resentment, and betrayal. Trustees fled their seats, abandoning their official posts like soldiers deserting a sinking ship. Staff members scrambled toward the exits, some climbing onto tables in a desperate attempt to escape the fray, others ducking under them for cover. The polished world of government, the decorum, the rules, the authority, disintegrated in an instant, exposing the primal, chaotic human nature underneath. And then, just when it seemed the scene couldn't get any worse, it did. Mayor Tiffany Henyard, the highest elected official in the room, the figure who was supposed to be the beacon of calm and order, stood up from her seat at the head of the board. Without hesitation, without even a second's thought, she launched herself straight into the fight. Her polished image, carefully built over years of campaigning and public appearances, shattered like glass. She didn't yell for order. She didn't demand peace. She didn't even try to mediate from a distance. She physically entered the brawl, blurring the line between leader and combatant in a way that would haunt Dolton for a long time to come. In that moment, it no longer mattered whether she was trying to pull people apart or throw her own punches. In the eyes of the community, the symbolism was already sealed. The leader had descended into chaos right alongside everyone else. Eyewitness Megan Dudek, a longtime Dolton resident who had faithfully attended board meetings for over a decade, later told reporters, her voice still shaking from the shock, "I have never seen a politician jump in and fight like that. It was scary and horrible. It is an embarrassment." Her words weren't just an opinion. They were a summary of a community's heartbreak. Elderly residents, who had come that evening clutching notepads and questions about the township's future, watched in stunned disbelief. Some wiped away tears. Others simply stared, unable to comprehend how the woman they had once proudly voted for had become part of such a public spectacle. The woman who had once promised hope, reform, and dignity now stood, disheveled, furious, and unrecognizable, in the middle of an all-out brawl. It wasn't just the physical wounds inflicted that night that hurt the town, it was the psychological ones. The realization that maybe their leadership wasn't just flawed, but fundamentally broken, that maybe trust once shattered could never fully be repaired. Security struggled desperately to regain control, but it was like trying to catch a tornado with bare hands. The room, once meant for structured debate and decision-making, had devolved into a full-fledged battlefield. Men and women alike kicked, punched, shoved, and screamed. The echoes of violence bounced off the walls. Tables were flipped over like flimsy toys, chairs toppled and slid across the floor. Important documents, once neatly stacked agendas, and township reports now floated through the air like sad, weightless confetti, a bitter reminder of how fragile order really is. Amid the madness, Mayor Tiffany Henyard herself was swept into the chaos. In the scuffle, she was knocked to the floor. The supposed pillar of Dolton leadership brought crashing down like a fallen statue. One of her shoes flew off, sliding helplessly across the polished tile before coming to rest beneath a nearby table, abandoned and forgotten. It lay there, almost poetic, a small, tragic symbol of the collapse of dignity and leadership that had taken place before everyone's eyes. Gerald Williams, a longtime resident of Dolton who had watched the township's rise and fall for decades, stood outside the building after the meeting, shaking his head in visible disgust. "It should have never come to blows," he said bitterly. "And Tiffany should have never gotten involved. That's not leadership. That's chaos." His words resonated with many who had witnessed the night's events, people who had come with hopes of hearing solutions and left burdened by the weight of disillusionment. But the damage from that night wasn't just physical. The bruises would heal, chairs would be repaired, papers would be picked up. The real damage was deeper, a gaping wound in the already fragile trust between Dolton's government and its citizens. And in today's world, bad news doesn't just stay in the room where it happens. It explodes outward at the speed of light. Within hours, videos of the brawl flooded social media. Grainy phone footage captured every shocking moment, Tiffany Henyard thrown to the ground, Kamal Woods trading brutal blows with Jedediah Brown, security guards frantically pulling people apart, trustees fleeing as pandemonium reigned. Clips were shared, commented on, and dissected endlessly. Hashtags related to Dolton trended regionally. News outlets picked up the footage. What had happened in a single township meeting became a national spectacle, a public shaming that no press release could spin away. And then came Jedediah Brown's response. Refusing to let his voice be drowned out by the chaos, Brown took to Facebook with a blistering post. He didn't mince words. He called the incident a pre-planned setup, alleging that Henyard and her allies had deliberately provoked the confrontation in an attempt to silence his criticism. "Let's be clear here," he wrote passionately. "I was fighting them all. Kamal grabbed my jacket at the beginning, which is why my head was down, but I powered through and was over him. I still popped every single one of them, including Tiffany, who hit me first, before being picked up like a toddler and having to fight security in the back room by the elevator." His words were raw, brutal, unfiltered, a mirror of the violence he had endured. And yet, hidden within the bravado was a clear, powerful message. He would not be bullied into silence. No matter how dirty the fight became, he would continue to speak truth to power. For many in Dolton, that night wasn't just a blip or an embarrassing moment to be quietly forgotten. It was the culmination of years of frustration boiling over. A collective cry from a community that had watched its leadership degrade from hopeful promises to painful betrayals. Critics pointed to a long list of grievances: mismanagement of township funds, mysterious and questionable hiring practices, favoritism toward political allies, and a pervasive culture of fear among township employees. Town hall meetings, once places of civil discussion, had increasingly turned hostile, tense, and unproductive. And at the center of it all was Tiffany Henyard, the woman who had once stood as a symbol of progress, but had now become, to many, a warning. The nickname Dolton Dictator wasn't just a casual insult whispered in frustration anymore. It had become, in the minds of many residents, an official title, a verdict rendered not in courtrooms, but in the hearts and minds of the very people she was meant to serve. Dolton's tragedy wasn't just the brawl that everyone saw. It was the slow, devastating realization that those in power had lost their way, and perhaps they had lost the trust of the people for good. Leadership is supposed to mean calm under pressure, wisdom in the face of provocation, a willingness to rise above personal slights for the greater good. But that night in Dolton, leadership meant none of those things. That night, leadership meant fists flying, shouts echoing off the walls, and a single lost shoe lying abandoned on the floor. A haunting relic of a meeting gone terribly wrong, and yet even amid the wreckage, even after the last punch was thrown and the last chair was overturned, there were still people who believed. People who refused to let Dolton's story end here. People who understood that Dolton's spirit, the real heartbeat of the town, was never found in politicians or board meetings. It lived in the everyday resilience of its people. The single mothers juggling 2 jobs, the grandparents holding on to homes they built with their own hands, the young kids looking out windows and daring to dream of something better. They deserve better than what they witnessed that night. They deserve leadership that heals, not leadership that harms. Change doesn't come easily. It rarely does. It's born from the slow, painful work of rebuilding what was broken. From electing leaders who understand that power isn't a trophy to flaunt. It's a responsibility to serve. Change comes from communities refusing to accept chaos and corruption as the price they must pay to be heard. What happened in Dolton wasn't just a local embarrassment. It was a national warning, a flashing red light to every town and city across America. When leaders forget their purpose, it's the people who bleed. When power becomes a weapon instead of a shield, it's the communities that pay the price. But Dolton's story isn't over, not yet. There is still time for it to be a story of resilience, of strength, of a town that was broken, but didn't stay broken, of people who demanded more, and got it. Because true leadership isn't about who can throw the hardest punch. It's about who can still stand tall when everything around them falls apart. And in Dolton, despite everything, there are still people standing. If you believe in accountability, if you believe Dolton and towns like it deserve better, don't stay silent. Speak up. Demand better. Because the only thing stronger than broken leadership is a united community that refuses to break.